Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Environmental Social Justice. I am Wendy Nystrom, your host, along with Joel Vendette and Joy Langford. Today's special guest is Mr. Dave Johnson. He is a law professor with Stanford University. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Wendy. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And so your specialty is designing our social structures to reduce racism. Could you explain what that means?
I'll do my best. And I will say that racism is one of the subjects that I'm looking at, but not the only subject that I'm looking at. I'm looking more generally at applying design thinking and thus the design to social systems, which for me means mostly law, policy, and norms. How do we apply design to the making of better law, policy, and thus norms? Or if we already have existing law that needs improvement, how do we redesign the law in an optimal way to achieve better objectives without upsetting the system, hopefully without having to break the system down to start over? Although I will confess that there are probably some areas where we would do well to break down the entire system and start over. I'm not sure if that's humanly possible. So we can talk about that sort of thing. But generally speaking, when you amend law and policy, which in my view generates most of the norms we have, not all, most of the norms we have in society, you have to do it, I'll say incrementally or modularly, but that does not mean necessarily in very small steps. Sometimes people think incremental means in very small steps. It doesn't have to be. You can have large steps incrementally, but as part of rebuilding a thing that already exists.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So I have a question. I don't know how much you follow like LA DA politics, but this whole thing going on with Gascon, DA Gascon, when they elected him, everybody wanted somebody different than the law and order Jackie Lacey, who really wanted people to, just, follow the law or go to jail. And then we have, now we have Gascon, who kind of has this, lazier attitude toward it. And we are now faced with, higher crime rates than we've already had in LA, as well as minority communities, minority victims being victimized even more, and lots of just issues around just being too easy on crime, especially in the environmental justice areas that you're speaking, the race areas. What say you about that kind of balance? Where do we get, a balance between hardcore and, too easy on criminals?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there's a lot of complexity in it. I do not follow LA politics. I do keep an eye on San Francisco politics, and I bring that up because you may know that we just had a recall, successful recall. In San Francisco, we had elected, and I don't live in San Francisco, so I didn't have a vote on this, but we elected about a year and a half, 2 years ago, a former public defender who was taking the, what I would call progressive approach to prosecution. So he became elected DA and took the approach that, drug crimes we're going to go alternative on drug crimes, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a different philosophy. And after about a year and a half, he got so much pushback from the regulars, the career assistant DAs, that they fomented a recall campaign. Well, I don't know if it was right or wrong to do it, but they succeeded. And they got what I think we would call a hardcore DA in place, who is currently cleaning house and putting law and order types, what I would call Maslow level 4 law and order types, into the DA's office. And we'll see. The thing I want to bring to the surface here is there are competing points of view, and each of which is backed with some research and data. There are competing points of view about whether or not there's a correlation or a direct, strong correlation between the severity and conservative approach to prosecuting crimes, prosecuting every crime, going for the heaviest sentence, et cetera, on crimes that are going to trial or being pled out, and the actual crime rate in a given city. I am not persuaded that correlation is any more than is generally loose. My personal opinion, and it's just an opinion, this is not my area, criminal is not my area. My personal opinion is that the spike in crime in San Francisco, and perhaps the spike in crime in LA or other cities, but certainly in San Francisco, was primarily driven by the pandemic. When the city emptied out and people left the city, there were no more people in the office buildings. It was just the population kind of evaporated from the city. And I saw it with my own eyes, and it made for a much more accessible space for criminals who are inclined towards that behavior to continue and increase their criminal behavior. Now, will that ratchet back as the city fills up again? Maybe. Will that ratchet back because the DA is now prosecuting pretty much everything they can get their fingers on? Maybe. But I think a lot of this is politics and trying to get elected and following the emotions of the populace. Crime is up. I'm seeing more on the local news. My neighbor's car got broken into. I heard gunshots the other night. Is going to cause people naturally to say, I'm going to vote for the hardcore prosecutor. But it's a complex problem. It's a social problem as much as it is a criminal law and prosecutorial problem. And so I obviously don't have the right answer to this, but I think we need to think of it in a larger, this is where, I like to think about, the way I like to think about things, it's a holistic system of multiple factors that are impinging on a certain problem or issue. And we have to unravel the system to really discern where the fix best resides.
Yeah, we see that at the national level right now. They're trying to, they're starting the 988 number for people with mental illness, or if they're just going through a crisis or suicidal, and they're rolling it out. However, every city admits that they do not have enough staffing for this.
Yeah.
So what happens when you call up, you're having a mental health episode and they put you on hold, or you're listening to elevator music?
Right.
The holistic approach that you're speaking of, Dave, is just, it's important, right? But where's the funding going to come from? Who's going to lobby for such actions? It just seems to still be in such disarray on how we get a grasp on all of the issues that we have.
Well, I think you point out the reason we have to look at it holistically, because if you elect a hardcore DA and you want that to be the approach, and you're going to prosecute everything to an inch of the law for the purpose of trying to create a disincentive for criminals to become active, then you have to fund 9/11. You can't have a weak link in the chain that's going to destroy your strategy. And so, I personally have called 911 and been put on hold. And it's the most frustrating thing in the world when somebody's actively breaking into your house and 911 puts you on hold. So, yes, it is a matter of funding, and funding is a matter of political choice. The politicians ostensibly apply the money where their constituents tell them to apply the money. Now that's a nice theory, and that's what's supposed to happen. It's not necessarily what always happens, but sure, if that link in the chain, the necessary link in the chain is broken or malfunctioning, it has to be fixed. And that's a really good example of why you have to look at the entire system to make sure that the changes the end result that you want to see can actually be accomplished by touching and repairing all of the flawed elements in the system.
Joel?
Well, no, because it's like it just seems like the logical way to do it, which we don't do anymore, is people just freaking talk to one another, because
No.
we have extremes on both sides, whatever your political leanings are, who are trying to run the show. And it's like, normally, if you find that area in the middle, that's where we can build upon and actually create some sort of a solution. And it seems like that doesn't happen, no matter
No.
what the subject is anymore.
No.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with Joel. We're not meeting in the middle.
You are canceled. You say one thing wrong, you are completely canceled online, on just in life. It's like clicks are not even what they used to be anymore. They're pretty hardcore, and you just have to monitor everything that you say. There's no freedom of speech anymore.
And to try to find a solution to any crisis that we have right now, it's not going to come from one side only. It's just not. That never works. I mean, this isn't a dictatorship. We don't live in nirvana and utopia where everything's peachy keen and we're singing kumbaya every evening. It's like people have to get down and dirty, nitty gritty, and really have a conversation on how we can hash things out in a way to move forward. That doesn't happen anymore. Everybody's dug their heels in and like, nope, this is it. And it's like, that never works.
It doesn't, and you're right. It doesn't work at the government level or the like
day-to-day life. It doesn't work.
Full of controversy for your local, commissioner seat, where you're not able to get things done, or school boards, or Uvalde. It took 70 something police officers to stand in a hallway. And out of 77 people, nobody could figure out, rush the guy, rush the classroom. So
nobody wanted to be in control.
It's a bureaucracy that no matter where you look these days, that's very hard to navigate.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're talking about one of the real problems of the day, and this inability to communicate across the chasm is in my mind, more normative, more cultural than it is legal or policy. And again, I think there are several factors. I lay no small amount of the blame on the political strategies of the right half of the political spectrum. They have made it quite clear, and I'm not trying to be political here because I happen to be left-leaning. I think objectively, most folks realize that over the last 50 years, the right side has spent a lot more money and put a lot more energy and effort into figuring out ways to divide the country culturally in order to gain political power. And that has consequences. Maybe they were intended, maybe some of them are unintended, but this is something that has developed over a long period of time. I would say, we were talking earlier before coming on camera about 50 years ago with Roe v. Wade and the beginning of the attack on Roe with the linguistics of pro-choice versus pro-life, which is a concoction of linguistics who are advocating to divide the country and to try and make one side look more moral than the other. And by doing so, creating what we call, driving the thin edge of the wedge and then bringing out the hammer and just banging on that wedge for 50 years until the country is irreversibly split and basically spitting blood at each other. Now, that tends to, spread, and that's where we are. And both sides are responsible, but you can't, we all learned in the class in elementary or, junior high school, at least I certainly did, is you can't be a nice guy to a bully and expect the bully to meet you halfway. It isn't going to happen because bullies are built to be bullies, and being a nice guy to a bully doesn't work. We know this is human nature. And so trying to meet somebody halfway who's behaving like a bully is not the answer. I can't begin to sort of articulate what the answer is because we're all working on trying to solve that problem. But we all have friends and neighbors with whom we can solve disagreement relatively easily.
You don't even
Why
want
can we do that? Why can we do that? But if it becomes political or if it's online, and I put no small amount of fault, I don't mean conscious fault or conscious responsibility, but fault in the way that social media has exacerbated this problem of being unable to communicate because we're at a distance, it's asynchronous, it is stripped bare of any real content. When we talk to one another and we see each other face to face in real time, we understand the give and take of disagreement and ultimately negotiating to an agreement or a compromise. That doesn't happen online because the way Twitter or Facebook works, it's set up to create polarization, not set up to create compromise. And that's a fundamental problem with the ubiquity of Facebook and Twitter right now. Joy, I'm sorry I interrupted you there for a second.
Oh, no, you're right on point. And I really like your analogy of the wedge, right? And you see it getting hammered really quickly. So we're not even on Roe v. Wade anymore. Now we're into repealing marriage rights for the LGBT community. So they've moved quick, even in the last 2 weeks, to move from, abortion rights, even for young kids that get pregnant from rape or what have you, to 2 weeks down, now we're getting into the marriage rights thing again. So you're right.
Yeah.
Nicety does not always work. Nicety is giving the opponent the opportunity to, sledgehammer something just because you want to be nice and polite about it. Does not always work.
Yeah, I want to expand on that point because it's really easy to look back at sort of what we have forgotten. The pattern is so obvious that it demonstrates the strategy. So you'll remember there was from time to time at strategic moments in the public dialogue, there were caravans of immigrants coming up from Mexico. And then all of a sudden they're gone. It's not an issue anymore. Well, then it was Dr. Seuss in children's books. It was a huge issue. And then all of a sudden it's gone. You know what's next? Critical race theory. I read the original article on critical race when it came out at Harvard in 1982, 83, when I was in law school. Critical theory and thus critical race theory is such a deep, complex, and mind-blowing kind of legal philosophy that legal scholars barely want to try and play with it. It is really powerful. It's really potent. It's good stuff. It resides in legal academia. Very few of them even teach it to law students. You could talk to 100 law students, and I would bet you that 97% of them have not read one word of critical theory. And yet the Republicans figured out that if they talk about banning critical race theory in elementary school, they will get votes, they will get support. And so they go and do it. They don't care about critical race theory. They don't even understand critical race theory. But you know what? That was the thing of the moment. What think tank that's coming out of, or group of think tanks that these like bombs are coming out of, I don't know, but they're coming out of somewhere, and there is a group of people out there that is figuring out which ones are going to work, which ones are going to hit, which ones come next, what's next in the sequence. And yeah, since Roe got overturned with the most ridiculous Supreme Court opinion ever written, then of course we're going to be talking about Obergefell and maybe Loving, I don't know. And so, yeah, this is a strategy. This has been planned for decades, and it's getting momentum. It's gaining its momentum, and we do have to stop it. We do have to figure out how to dampen this runaway train.
One of the things, just to kind of circle back to our original topic, talking about policing and racism, but you mentioned that we've had 50 years of wealth inequality, and that wealth is being used to pump money into certain political parties to drive that wedge further and deeper. and our lack of communication across races and genders and, sexual orientations. How can we fix this? I mean, I know there's no easy way, but what messaging can we give to tell people, stop, you and I talked about, stop being afraid to ask questions, stop being afraid to talk to people and communicate, because there is a fear.
This one may be an example of what I alluded to earlier, which is a system that by all objective accounts should be blown up and rebuilt from scratch, but it can't happen. And that's the sort of intertwined, or the double helix, if you will, of the individual freedoms that are guaranteed in the US, coupled with what is essentially free market, neoliberal free market capitalism. I want to go back to, we've all heard of Adam Smith's invisible hand from, 100 years ago, with his Wealth of Nations book, and the invisible hand that was supposed to be able to regulate excesses in free market capitalism. And the reason I bring that up is because I only came across this recently, but there's a Nobel economist by the name of Joseph Stiglitz, whose name may ring a bell. And he was writing about this, and he was writing about the invisible hand, and I was really taken back by his response. And he said, the reason Adam Smith's hand is invisible so often is because a lot of the times it's not there. Which is to say, it was a fictional concept to begin with. It was an idea. It was a label, this invisible hand that was supposed to control runaway free market capitalism. And he points out that, hey, maybe it was a mirage all along, and we were relying on this unseen controller that supposedly resided in the system of free market capitalism. Well, we find out that if it is there, it's not doing its job. It's laying dormant, and we get to a place where more and more free market capitalism is part of this really, what I'm going to say, adverse positive feedback loop. Because when we talk about feedback loops, a positive feedback loop is one where it builds on itself, but it can be one that generates negative results. So we have a feedback loop where where free market capitalism allows more money aggregation, and that money aggregation allows for influence in government, which allows for more money aggregation, which allows for more influence in government, and you get to a point where big money now owns government, and big money and communications. Let's look at Fox. And now we have big money that is controlling government and communications, as opposed to the people via government controlling money and communications. So at a very structural level, there's been this evolution of a system that had flawed rules within it. If you take the point of view that there ought to be an egalitarian economic system. And that's why we see the rise of billionaires. Shoot, I've been 30 years in Silicon Valley. I remember distinctly 20, 25 years ago, sitting next to Mark Zuckerberg when Facebook was just starting up and shooting the breeze over a plate of cheap spaghetti. But you know what? That's never going to happen again. And we just have, these unicorn companies popping up all over the place. It used to be something meaningful to talk about your startup being a unicorn, no longer. And we're going to have just another crop of 10, 11 digit billionaires. And I don't know how, I don't have the solution to that except to get government to stiffen its spine via, hopefully, the popular voice, stiffen its spine and impose tax rates that are reflective of what we had back in the Eisenhower years, and even through, I think, LBJ, where the tax rates were 50, 60, even 70% for the wealthiest of the wealthy, and start to do what conservatives dislike intensely for reasons that are obvious, which is distribute the overall wealth more equally across the population so that all of society can benefit. whether it's through increased tax spending for things like, enough 9/11 operators, or structures that support education for all instead of the very few. It's, by the way, I will say this, and I may get slammed for this, but it is not an accident that all of these people that we are seeing in the last 5-8 years, not all, an undue percentage of these people who are being caught out cheating, lying, and grifting in government these days are coming out of elite educational institutions.
Oh yeah,
my own included.
Yeah.
They're not coming from Erie Community College.
No, because I mean, quite honestly, running a campaign is extraordinarily expensive. You need a ton of money just to get your name out there and get known. And plus, any government job is tough. I mean, being a politician and, presidency, vice presidency, Joy knows this firsthand, it's not a fun job. And a lot of people, as the billionaires, like, I can make $1 billion with my unicorn company, or I could be a public servant. What's going to win?
Yeah. And, it's interesting. You see it more and more these days. They're hot. It's sort of saying the quiet part out loud anymore. But you look at the news and they talk about a political race. The first thing they say, they don't say this person stands for these policies and that person stands for those policies, or even what their background in politics or public service might be. The first thing out of the box is Joe has $8 million in his war chest and Judy has, 15 million in his war chest. That's the first thing. Why is it? Because elections are bought.
Yes. I know Joel and I have had extensive conversations because, social media is a big issue. Money in government is a big issue. Now, you and I, Dave, we spoke previously. I don't know if this is law or just simply regulation or just good policy, but in some countries, the CEO is only allowed to make X amount more than the lowest paid person. So rather than CEOs making, $1 billion a year and then a staffer making $15 an hour, if that, they'd close that huge wealth gap. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's something possible for the United States, or are these large corporations? And Joel's just like, hell's no. Am I being naive, Dave?
No. Let's because I don't know the answer to the original question. Let's assume, for argument's sake, and I think it's probably accurate, that there are some countries where it's actually the law. There are some countries where it's a powerful norm, but it's not the law. But it's so embarrassing for a CEO to make so much more than their workers that they keep that gap relatively close. And then you have countries where it's ignored. The problem, again, that we have in the U.S. is any law, assuming you could get it through Congress or even in one state, but it'd probably have to be federal, you could get it through Congress and signed by a president, is probably going to be unconstitutional. A law that forces a private company, to limit the amount of money its board of directors chooses to pay a CEO relative to the least or relative to the rest of the company, let's just put it that way, I don't think is going to withstand constitutional muster. And, that's just the code set, if you will, that has been written, 225, 230 some odd years ago, that Misters Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Ms. Barrett all want to think we have to abide through an originalist lens, which is, in my view, the most nonsensical way to read the Constitution one could possibly conceive of. The reason originalism is attractive to conservatives is because it allows you to basically engage in backward judging. You decide what answer you want. You go back and say, well, this is what the founders would or would not have said. And then you come up with the answer that you want. It's ridiculous. And I think most constitutional scholars would agree that originalism is not an appropriate approach. It's a little bit different than textualism. It's not a far stretch from textualism, which is a little bit more sane. But we're so far away from the roots of the founders' understanding of what they were writing. The Constitution's a great document, don't get me wrong, but we need to read it with some common sense in the era in which we live. And
that's funny.
I know, Jules.
But the problem is that the rights that are ensconced in the Constitution, the life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, individual property, which means wealth, are so firmly ensconced. It's going to be hard to get a law passed that forces that to happen. If it's going to happen, it's more likely to happen through public pressure on big corporations who use it as a norm, create the norm of setting a gap, a spread between their CEO and their lowest paid employees.
I would just like to add in real quick on that CEO pay. If if this public pressure thing is the way we go, we obviously can't make law. But I've seen so many times where a CEO did not meet expectations, did not do the job required. So they were asked to step down from their position, but with a several $1 million parachute. And it's like, why are you paying? I mean, when people get fired or laid off, they are not given, a big chunk of money to leave. It's basically like, this didn't work out. So when,
I've seen this firsthand. I've been a general counsel inside public and private companies. And I'll tell you, this is how it works, is those payouts are contracted for when the CEO comes on board. It's in the contract before the CEO takes the job. It's part and parcel of hiring the CEO that you want. The market forces allow a really good, experienced CEO to say, all right, I'll come on board. Here's my comp, but this has to be my exit package or I won't sign up. And so that money is going to legally have to get paid out. The exception that companies try, and their GCs try very hard to put into those packages, is if there's a for-cause termination. And those tend to be narrowly defined, but there are for-cause terminations where that money isn't paid. I can give you one example. The termination, not really a CEO, but it's the one that comes to mind, the termination of the head coach, John Gruden, for the Oakland Raiders, actually Las Vegas Raiders. Sorry, there's my Northern California bias. When he was fired, quote unquote, for cause by the team, he had it. They refused to pay his contractual exit package. He actually filed a lawsuit. It's pending now to try and get paid that money. And as most lawsuits, it'll probably settle for some amount of money in the middle. But those are hard to avoid. Again, freedom of contract and enforceability. That's what happens in large companies with CEOs who have the negotiation leverage to demand it and get it.
That's I did not realize that was part of it makes sense. Now that I'm saying this out loud, it makes absolute sense. So since we've run into our 30 minutes, I just wanted to close out with thank you for your time.
Thank you.
How can people find you if they want to reach out and have these discussions more in depth with you? What's the best way?
The best way to contact me is email, which is, I think, still available on my Stanford faculty bio, Stanford faculty directory, which is publicly available. So feel free to send me an email. How much time I can give any one email, that we'll see how many emails come in, but I'm happy to communicate and talk with anybody about this subject. Sure.
Just to kind of we talked about many different things today. Today was a fantastic discussion, but I think just, to wrapping it together, communication is key. We need to start talking to each other across party lines, political lines, whatever it is. We need to start talking more equality. And, that wealth gap that we see that's getting wider and wider, our middle class is disappearing. We need to seriously address that. We need to put some public pressure on either government or private sector. And, as Joel's favorite topic, social media is dangerous. Don't focus on it. Don't listen to everything they say. Do some research, look into your own data. That's the best advice I can give. So on that, folks, I thank you for your time. We will see you next time. I'm Wendy Nystrom with Environmental Social Justice. I thank Dave Johnson, professor at Stanford University, and of course, my favorite co-hosts, Joy and Joel. So thank you guys so much, and we will see you next time.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.